If you're new in town or just new to this whole podcast thing, you're tuning in to Law by Night, the podcast that discusses all things vampiric with no fear of breaching the Masquerade. In this episode, we shall review The Hunter's Hunted 2, a sourcebook primarily for Vampire the Masquerade 20th Anniversary Edition. I shall present my thoughts and opinions on its presentation and mechanics to help you better decide whether this is the sourcebook for you. If you are listening to this review and have kept up to date with all the latest World of Darkness news and the rest of the controversial Eurojank, you will know that World of Darkness HQ are working on Hunter the Reckoning 5th edition, which may go live by the time this episode hits the airwaves. Now, did anyone ask for the return of Hunter the Reckoning? No. Not really. Is anyone official intending on explaining why 2nd through 4th editions are being omitted? No, but if I were to hazard a guess, it is probably to save confusion for anybody who can't count. For the two people who have asked me whether I intend on covering Hunter the Reckoning material, I have no real intention of covering any lore for this forgotten franchise. The little that is there is not terribly engaging, and I'm not really sure why a whole new system is needed to play as mortals in the World of Darkness. Mortal-orientated sourcebooks for pretty much all the supernatural splats are readily available for folks to use in their chronicles, and there is a demand for them, as the most recent of these, World of Darkness Ghost Hunters, was released the 13th of October 2021, which is almost 7 months ago as of the release of this episode. You also have the V5 Companion Guide, which has a chapter on playing mortals. Of course, this episode isn't about that book, which you have hopefully worked out if you listened to the introduction of this episode or read the bloody title. This is about The Hunter's Hunted 2, the 20th anniversary update of the original Hunter's Hunted book. Technically, it is the 21st anniversary edition update, as Hunter's Hunted 2 was released the 13th of July 2013, whilst Hunter's Hunted was released in 1992, but at this point I'm just being terribly pedantic for the sake of that one snotty YouTube commenter who will no doubt attempt to lecture me on my channel. Petty stabs aside, Hunter's Hunted 2, much like its predecessor, has players assume the role of mortal vampire hunters, but how good does it portray that idea exactly? But before I answer that and explore the rest of the book, here are the rules for the Law by Night book reviews. I will explore snippets of the lore, mechanics and rules found within the tome. I will look as to how they are presented and how easily they are conveyed to new and old players alike. As this is a review written and presented by me, all thoughts and opinions are my own, so if you disagree with something I've said, that is totally fine. It does not mean that you're right and I'm wrong and vice versa. Finally, I should note that as of the writing of this script, I do not own the first Hunter's Hunted book, so I cannot make any direct comparisons between the two, and neither am I prepared to go out and buy one either, for reasons we shall soon explore. As with my previous book reviews, I will start at the very beginning, which is the physical book itself, which currently sits nicely upon my lap. It is a letter-sized hardback book with the infamous green marble like practically every Vampire the Masquerade core book before then and everything else in the V20 line. Like regular V20, it is made of a slightly squishy hardback material, presumably some form of cardboard, that is somewhat harder than its vanilla counterpart, but it is a tome that will mark easily all the same. Being a source book, it is also much smaller than the accompanying core book. Those that own the original Hunter's Hunted book would recognise the styling of the edgy and almost illegible title, be it with some minor tweaks. Similarly, those that have purchased Onyx Path VTM sourcebooks before would recognise the artwork style found in and on the book. A lot of it, mainly the chalky, possibly watercoloured styled pieces found at the beginning of most chapters, are perhaps what I would be prepared to call the Onyx Path style. The book does have plenty varying styles, all of which capturing the inclusive and almost claustrophobic lifestyle that is the Mortal Hunter, as well as other cool set pieces like the tense painting on page 145. I do have some grievances, however, with the piece on page 43 by Steven Stahlberg, whose work I previously praised in my V20 Companion Guide review. Look, I'm bi. I'm human. I sometimes succumb to the powers of a pretty woman with a cleavage poking out of an unbuttoned shirt, nibbling on the arms of her thick black glasses as she enjoys you, the reader, more than the big blank book on her lap. Doesn't look like a piece that should exist in the World of Darkness in my opinion, but hey, what do I know? When you open the book and read the melancholic short story, you are greeted with a standard World of Darkness introductory chapter that details the themes and moods of the book and what exactly you will find in its 6, technically 7 chapters. It informs the reader how it is an extension of VTM in terms of horror, whilst explaining to the reader how the constant state of fear in the unknown and sacrifice is forever present. A common theme for horror for sure, but in Hunter games, someone will die. Will it be you, your companions, or the bloodsuckers? Whilst it doesn't explicitly state this book isn't exclusively connected to the other larger groups of supernatural hunters like the Inquisition or the Arcanum. Yes, they are mentioned and explored in this book, but Hunter x Hunter 2 is more for the individual hunter, the underdog vigilantes, so to speak. This leads into the first chapter, which is told from the perspective of one hunter speaking to another who is gagged and strapped into a chair, providing flavour and context to the lonely, desperate hunter. Immediately, you learn that playing a hunter is very different to playing a vampire. Now that might sound obvious, but think about it for a moment. Vampire the Masquerade is presented as a personal horror game as the player comes to terms with being a monster as you fight with the inner beast and degrading memories and concepts of humanity. Hunters in this book also deal with this as well as the similar isolation, but on the flip side. What makes the hunters stand out here is they do not empathise with the struggle because they simply do not know or care. It might be hard for VTM players of any experience level to remove themselves from the familiar themes of personal horror of Vampire the Masquerade and put them in the mortal hunter, and the writers clearly knew this, as Chapter 1 presents the who's and whys of vampire hunting in the World of Darkness, as well as various motivations like the classic revenge and righteousness to the more concerning curiosity and thrill seekers, all of which provide a substantial amount of information for the totally clueless and or timid. I wish to remind you yet again, these hunters are everyday people, for the most part. They have jobs and lives outside of their hunting. You can play the late night shift worker, the paranoid government agent, or righteous holy person. Heck, your cohort could be all of these things, and the chapter gives you the tools and ideas how you could conjure the concept, how to put together a plan to take out the mother sucker, and how one would even locate other hunters and organise the team, whether you work by yourselves, part of some company, or, to use an actual example in this book, a university team who saw and brought in something a little too weird. The creativity provided is nearly endless. The chapter also highlights some other hunter groups from the solo's perspective, like Project Twilight and the Inquisition, and how they stand with solo hunters. Spoiler, they don't like solo hunters and vice versa, but you can read the book for yourself to find out why. The chapter even talks about how to deal with the authorities and what the average hunter would know about the Camarilla, or the C word, as it's referred to here, which I thought was kinda cute, as the C word, as you hopefully know, is a lot ruder than that. To conclude the chapter, it ends with touching upon the other supernaturals in the World of Darkness, and some desperate last words the narrating hunter gives to the gagged and bound one. Following this is the chapter creation chapter, which I feel I don't need to cover very much here, given the previous episode of this podcast was all about character creation of this game. It condenses everything you have read thus far into useful, concise small paragraphs, whilst prodding the creative juices in your brain. New backgrounds and merits and flaws are presented as well, with the backgrounds being rather interesting and engaging, whereas the merits and flaws in this chapter are not, in my totally honest opinion. Chapter 3 is a large chapter that expands upon the tools and tactics solo hunters may use when going up against vampires. Pages upon pages of text that talks about the usage of fire, weapons, planning, the pros and cons of fighting as a group and on your own, getting information, how to investigate, and much, much more. The chapter placement is weird to me because this really feels like a part of the storytelling chapter or right before it. Given how large those chapters are, it might have been too daunting to read them both side by side, but that is really just a guess, which may or may not be well educated. It's not all just for STs though, as this chapter provides different combat mechanics for folks to consider, addresses that using guns is not always the best sort of approach when taking on vampires, ways to experiment with homemade firearms and explosives in games, and the elephant in the room that is the fact that the hunters you play in this game are kind of terrorists. It is a very well thought out chapter that covers all the things the ST could think of and a little bit more. It is a shame that the one thing weighing it down is the lack of artwork that just makes makes it seem less dense to wade through. The same can't be said of the next chapter, which has Numina powers certain mortals can acquire. It presents a small pool of available psychic powers, which are essentially what Numina is within the confines of the World of Darkness. You learn how to purchase them at character creation, and most importantly of all, are schooled in how weird and wacky Numina is, and how alienated it should make yourself, other mortals feel, and not just the other hunters. Contrary to popular belief, not every hunter has true faith. The chapter reinforces the ST to define what is and isn't okay in their chronicle. If you want a group of, I don't know, CIA operatives spanning cyberkinesis, sure, go for it, but it might be a little jarring if you want a more serious mood. Similar to the previous chapter, I felt this should have followed the character creation chapter, but it is a small personal taste thing that doesn't affect the book in any major way. Now we move on to the Storyteller chapter, which, like the chapter on Tools and Tactics, which is chapter 3, is a very lengthy one and presents lots for STs new and old to play and experiment with. It presents vampires and the sects from the mundane perspective, including the Talmehera and the Inconnu for some reason, as well as ways one could introduce the likes of wraiths, mages and werewolves into a chronicle or one-shot. I used this chapter a little when I was planning my World of Darkness 5th edition one-shot, Silent Night, which you can listen to at your own leisure. I needed some good resources to pull me out of VTM know-it-all brain and rethink my understanding of vampires, and this chapter is perfect for that sort of re-education, as it were, in addition to how to adjust and ramp up the tension and horror for your chronicles so nothing gets too stale or too much. Chapter 6 takes a look and expands upon various organisations and hunters presented in V20, such as the Society of Leopold, various American governmental bodies, and the Arcanum, the latter having the most information presented about them in any recent World of Darkness book to date, or at the very least, to my memory. Presented are various different factions within them that players could choose to be a part of, or indeed fight against / alongside, each of which having their own hierarchy, as well as backgrounds, merits and flaws, in addition to a couple of Numina exclusive to them. I do think the 7-point merit the Fist of God is a bit fucking stupid and almost contradictory, given its humanity requirement. That said, the idea of whooping ass and cracking jawbones open in the name of the Lord is fucking hilarious, and if that isn't enough, various weapons, armors, and relics can be found also, some more bombastic than others. More interesting, however, is the use of criminal organizations like the Mafia and Russian Mob that players can volunteer to play as, or STs can include for that added bit of tension and antagonistic oppression. The chapter also addresses how a lot of criminal organizations were hit by the RICO Act, and how one may go about implementing that or just going fuck it and include them how you please. After all, this is the World of Darkness. Finally, we have the Appendix chapter, which is filled with varying template characters. If you don't know what this entails, allow me to explain. Many of the older source books in the World of Darkness line left a chapter or part of one for ready-made characters, so players could pick one up and just play if they're not too familiar with the system or settings. In the case of Hunters Hunted 2, some are more interesting than others, and a lot of the women artwork here looks very similar to each other, which is a little disappointing. With some other minor printing errors in the character sheets, it does feel like a rushed chapter to include in an otherwise well-informed book. It isn't just well-informed, but a very engaging book that never fails to make the mortal hunter inferior yet deadly at the same time. It is a brilliant resource book that you don't have to read from cover to cover to understand everything, as encouraged by the fantastic writing throughout. It really has anything a player of a mortal-driven game for Vampire the Masquerade could ever want and more, all presented in a book that is a game within a game. The information to mechanics in Hunters Hunted 2 can easily be used across any edition of Vampire the Masquerade, with very minimal tweaking to get the balance just right, even with the Second Inquisition in the 5th edition really perfecting the vampire hunter mindset. You can still take a lot from Hunters Hunted 2, so you can appreciate some of the thinking, so don't be dissuaded by the fact that this is a legacy edition book. I would actually encourage V5 only players to purchase this book, just to see where the SI came from. Blank body is a term mentioned here before it was ever mentioned in V5. As I stated previously, I used this book for a 5th edition Mortal one-shot, and I think my players wouldn't mind me saying that it managed to cause them to touch cloth. Yes, you too can wield such messy power by purchasing this book. I believe this is currently the definitive vampire-orientated hunter's book. It's rather telling really, when my only complaints are a couple of chapter placements, some walls of text, and a couple of printing errors. Little nags in an otherwise near flawless book. For those of you who are new to the Lore by Night brand and the reviews I occasionally do, I do not do out of 10 scores because they are subjectively pointless. One person's 10 out of 10 is another's 3 out of 5 stars, which is another's minus 42 out of 100, so I shall rate this book some end of the world type shit out of 10, as that is just as helpful as a proper out of 10 score. To be kept updated, follow the Lore by Night VTM Twitter and Instagram pages to find out when we will upload each episode. You can also find out by subscribing to the YouTube channel and clicking on the little bell, as you'll be immediately notified when the latest episode is live. Until next time, farewell.